We come now to our 4 o'clock study on Sabbath afternoon here at the Arkansas camp, 1981. And this is study number 5 now in our series on the lives of Daniel and of Jeremiah. We go back now to the book Prophets and Kings to continue our study of the beginnings of apostasy in the life of that great and marvellous man, Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived upon the face of the earth. And we'll see how, in his case, the trouble began and how it developed that point of view. And we were talking, as we closed last period, about the success which apparently succeeded the moves made by the king in marrying the daughter of Pharaoh. So I read now on page 53 about this success. From a human point of view, this marriage, though contrary to the teachings of God's law, seemed to prove a blessing. For Solomon's heathen wife was converted and united with him in the worship of the true God. Furthermore, Pharaoh rendered signal service to Israel by taking Gezer, slaying the Canaanites that dwelt in the city, and giving it for a present unto his daughter, Solomon's wife. This city Solomon rebuilt, and thus apparently greatly strengthened his kingdom along the Mediterranean seacoast. But in forming an alliance with a heathen nation and sealing the compact by marriage with an idolatrous princess, Solomon rashly disregarded the wise provision that God had made for maintaining the purity of his people. The hope that his Egyptian wife might be converted was but a feeble excuse for the sin. That paragraph outlines for us the apparent success gained by these moves made by Solomon. Let me emphasize again that the purpose in Solomon's mind was to build up the kingdom of God. It was not an act of open rebellion. Everything about it looked as if it was in harmony with the principles of God. Although, of course, Solomon had to admit that the end was used to justify the means which he employed to gain this success. Now, passing over to page 54, it says, Solomon had begun to lose sight of the source of his power and glory. Note those words. Solomon had begun to lose sight of the source of his power and glory. As inclination gained the ascendancy over reason, self-confidence increased, and he sought to carry out the Lord's purpose in his own way. Now, these two sentences are so important in respect to our understanding of the Sabbath rest principles that we need to just go over them for a moment and impress them upon our minds. First of all, what did Solomon begin to lose sight of? His source, the source of his power and the source of his glory. Now, as surely as a person loses sight of the source of everything, of our power and our glory, then because we must have a plan maker, man will turn to another source for plans apart from God the source. Bearing in mind, of course, that Solomon was the wisest man upon the face of the earth at that point of time, then very naturally, who did he then look to as the source of his plans? Himself. And at the same time, of course, Satan was very happy to have Solomon continue to believe that he was working for the building up of God's kingdom. And can you believe that? Satan was happy to have Solomon continue to work for the upbuilding of God's kingdom, provided that Solomon did that after his own plans and not after God's plans. Now, why do you suppose that Satan was pleased for Solomon to continue to work for the upbuilding of God's kingdom, but after his own plans? First of all, because Satan knew perfectly well that if Solomon worked hard to build up the kingdom of God, he would believe that he was following God's ways, while at the same time, if he tried to build it up by working after his own ways, then there would be established in Solomon's experience the principle of the papacy, which puts man in the place of God and guarantees the ultimate destruction of the kingdom. In other words, Satan had the best of both worlds. He had Solomon literally building up Satan's kingdom, while believing He was building up God's kingdom. And so Solomon was thoroughly deceived by the devil at this point of time. Now this brings to view, of course, the sheer necessity of our making certain that not only are we working for the upbuilding of God's kingdom, but that we're doing it in the right way. Remember that God said of ancient Israel, they have not known my ways, so I swear in my wrath they shall not enter into my rest. Now we might then, at this point, begin to itemize the points that led to the ultimate overthrow of King Solomon. And what was the first point? He'd begun to lose sight of his source. Now when we begin to lose sight of our source, number one here, he began to, put it all again, began to lose sight of his source. And inasmuch as the recognition and remembrance of true relationships, that is, the relationship of God the source, or I should put it the other way around, the relationship of a dependent human receiver to God the source, underlies the principles of Sabbath rest. Then the moment that Solomon began to lose sight of his source, then what did he begin to lose his grip on? The principles of God's Sabbath rest. Right away at that point of time. Now once a person begins to lose sight of those principles, inevitably the next step will be, in harmony with that, is that man will then try to build up God's work in man's own way. So now he sought to build God's work in his own way. And that, of course, was the literal turning away from the principles of God's Sabbath rest. It was a revelation of his loss of the knowledge of God's ways. Now, when he lost the knowledge of God's ways and plans God's work his own way, then what must he lose? Rest or peace. And, of course, then began the long downhill slide into total and complete apostasy. Let's read further now on page 54 of this book, Prophets and Kings. He reasoned that political and commercial alliances with the surrounding nations would bring these nations to a knowledge of the true God, and he entered into unholy alliance with nation after nation. Often these alliances were sealed by marriages with heathen princesses. The commands of Jehovah were set aside for the customs of surrounding peoples. Solomon flattered himself that his wisdom and the power of his example would lead his wives from idolatry to the worship of the true God, and also that the alliances thus formed would draw the nations around about into close touch with Israel. Vain hope. Solomon's mistake in regarding himself as strong enough to resist the influence of heathen associates was fatal. And fatal too, the deception that led him to hope that notwithstanding a disregard of God's law on his part, others might be led to revere and obey its sacred precepts. That's the old story, of course, of trying to keep the law by actually breaking it. And there was no possibility of that being a successful program in the life of Solomon as he thus went away from God. Now coming across to page 55, we'll note this next point now. So gradual was Solomon's apostasy that before he was aware of it, he had wandered far from God. Now apostasy is always a gradual thing. It always has advanced a long way before a person even begins to think or suspect that he is no longer working after the divine principles. For this reason, a person must be thoroughly educated to discern early in the piece that this drifting has begun to take place. Because only an educated mind can discern the nature of the evil and recognize that there must not be the slightest deviation from divine principles. I read now, almost imperceptibly, he began to trust less and less in divine guidance and blessing, and to put confidence in his own strength. Little by little, he withheld from God an unswerving obedience, which was to make Israel a peculiar people and conform more and more closely to the customs of the surrounding nations. Yielding to the temptations incident to his success in his honoured position, he forgot the source of his prosperity. Now, first of all, he began to lose sight of his source, and then we find he actually forgot the source of his prosperity. An ambition to excel all other nations in power and grandeur led him to pervert the selfish purposes the heavenly gifts hitherto employed for the glory of God. The money, which should have been held in sacred trust for the benefit of the worthy poor and for the extension of the principles of holy living throughout the world, was selfishly absorbed in ambitious projects. Now, this brought a change of character in this man, as of course might well be expected. Engrossed in an overmastering desire to surpass other nations in outward display, the king overlooked the need of acquiring beauty and perfection of character. In seeking to glorify himself before the world, he sold his honour and his integrity. The enormous revenues acquired through commerce with many lands were supplemented by heavy taxes. Thus pride, ambition, prodigality and indulgence bore fruit in cruelty and exaction. The conscientious, considerate spirit which had marked his dealings with the people during the early part of his reign was now changed. From the wisest and most merciful of rulers, he degenerated into a tyrant. Once the compassionate, God-fearing guardian of the people, he became oppressive and despotic. Tax after tax was levied upon the people, that means might be forthcoming to support the luxurious court. The people began to complain. The respect and admiration they had once cherished for their king was changed into disaffection and abhorrence. Let's now note the transition that took place between the wise and godly Solomon and the degenerate or apostate Solomon. And in the principles of Sabbath rest, and let's now compare this with the principles of Satan's kingdom. In the principles of Sabbath rest, the position of a king, such as Jesus Christ is the position of a servant. Right? Not the position of a master. That king is there for the people. The people are not there for the king, as far as the king's point of view is concerned. Now, so far as the people are concerned, they're there for the king, of course, in the sense that they are to cooperate or co-work with him in the development of a nation which will be a blessing to all. But now, in God's kingdom, the word says that all ye are what? Brethren. There is to be no such thing as man over man in the place of God. No such thing. But in Satan's kingdom, the king is not the servant of the people, but the king is the Lord and master over the people. In Satan's kingdom, the people are only there for the king. No other reason. Therefore, he has command or possession of their money, their lands, and even their bodies. Some may say that back in those days, if you displeased the king, and the king simply said to his servants, take his head off, how much recourse did you have? None at all. Your head was gone before you could even protest, for that matter. And no one could touch the king for so doing. But if you touched the king, if you hurt him or scratched him or killed one of his children, then what happened to you? You were killed for certain, because the people were there for the king and not the king for the people. And so Solomon was changed from being a wise, loving, just, generous benefactor of the people to a cruel and exacting tyrant who oppressed the people, exacted from them tremendous contributions and taxation, and became a king the people learned to complain against and eventually to fear and last of all to hate. Such was the transition from the one to the other. Now, as an evidence of the depth of apostasy into which the king sank, we read on page 57, first of all, that on the Mount of Olives, opposite Mount Moriah, where stood the beautiful temple of Jehovah, Solomon erected an imposing pile of buildings to be used as idolatrous shrines. To please his wives, he placed huge idols, unshapely images of wood and stone, amidst the groves of myrtle and olive. There, before the altars of heathen deities, Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon, were practiced the most degrading rites of heathenism. And remember, of course, in the early days of Solomon's reign, with great tender-heartedness, he had saved that child and given it back to his lawful mother. But he fell so low as to consent to the erection of an idol to whom living children were offered as sacrifices. Now, I understand, of course, that was the god Molech, that it was a huge brass or iron idol inside of which, the hollow of which was built a raging fire. And the children were literally delivered up and sacrificed in that fire. Now, can you think of a more degrading heathen or idol worship than that? And yet Solomon descended from that position of absolute purity down to that level of degradation. Now, the first steps in that downward path were that he began to lose sight of the source of his success, and he began to build God's work in his own way. In other words, instead of God being the plan maker for the building up of God's work, Solomon became the plan maker for the building up of God's work. Now, we are to recognize in the awesome degradation of that king the outworking of those causes, or the maturing of that kind of seed. Now, if that kind of seed produced that kind of result in Solomon, then to a lesser degree, only because we will have less power at our fingertips, what will that same kind of seed planted in our lives yield by way of a harvest? The same kind of fruit. There's no other possibility, because the simple law of nature says if you plant a given seed, you'll get a given result. If we plant the same seed as Solomon back there, of course, we shall likewise receive the same kind of result. We move on now to the next chapter, chapter 4, begins on page 61 in the book Prophets and Kings, to take up the next prominent cause of rebellion, of apostasy in the experience of Solomon. Page 61, Sister Wright says, prominent among the primary causes that led Solomon into extravagance and oppression was his failure to maintain and foster the spirit of self-sacrifice. Now, the manifestation of this failure on Solomon's part is brought to view in the erection of a temple that he erected up on Mount Moriah. And a comparison is now made between the building of the sanctuary back in the wilderness and the building of this glorious temple, which became one of the great wonders of the then known world. And let's see the comparison made between these two things to recognize that the same problem existed back in Moses' day as existed in the days of Solomon. And the problem was that in order to execute the magnificent buildings, which both buildings actually were, involving very, very fine and beautiful gold work, where gold was worked in the shape of almond flowers, where the cherubim were embroidered into the curtains above the sanctuary and so forth. And of course in Solomon's temple this ornamentation was extremely extensive and required the highest kind of skill in metalwork. Now, back in Moses' day, there just was not among the people such a person to execute that kind of work. And then in Solomon's day again, there was no such person to execute that kind of work. But back in Moses' day, God solved the problem by endowing two men, Aholiab and Bezaleel, with required skills. And when God did not have Moses send out to the children of the heathen around about them, but rather endowed some Israelites with the power to do the work which needed to be done. Now, Solomon ought never to have forgotten the lesson taught in that experience. But let's see what happened as I read now from Prophets and Kings, page 61. When at the foot of Sinai, Moses told the people of the divine command, let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them, the response of the Israelites was accompanied by the appropriate gifts. They came, everyone whose heart was stirred up, and everyone whom his spirit made willing, and brought offerings, Exodus 25 verse 8 and 35:21. For the building of the sanctuary, great and extensive preparations were necessary. A large amount of the most precious and costly material was required, but the Lord accepted only free will offerings. Of every man that giveth it willingly with his heart, you shall take my offering, was the command repeated by Moses to the congregation. Exodus 25 verse 2. Now comes the final important sentence in the paragraph, which says, devotion to God and a spirit of sacrifice were the first requisites in preparing a dwelling place for the Most High. In other words, anybody who came to participate in that structure who was not devoted to God and who did not possess a spirit of sacrifice did not have the requisites necessary to enable him to participate in that structure, and he would have been refused. Now in Solomon's day, a similar call to self-sacrifice was made when David turned over to Solomon the responsibility of building the temple. Of the assembled multitude, David asked, who then is willing to consecrate his service this day unto the Lord? This call to consecration and willing service should ever have been kept in mind by those who had to do with the erection of the temple. Now let's not forget that we today, who are called upon to build the final temple of God, which is a spiritual temple, in the last great third angel's message, must remember that we cannot participate in that work unless we possess what kind of spirit? Right? The spirit of self-sacrifice. Now back there they lost the spirit of self-sacrifice. When they lost that spirit, of course, God could no longer work through them to execute the mighty counsels of his will. And that was another extremely important factor in the departure from God, which marked that people back there. And again, it will be a factor which will mark our departure from God if we let it enter into our life experience. Now, back in Moses' day, as I said before, they faced the problem of workmen, or finding workmen with the skill and the wisdom to execute the work which God had planned and designed for that sanctuary. Now Moses could very easily have decided to advertise amongst the heathen nations around about for that kind of skilled work, because they were out there in the various tribes and nations around about. There were very, very skilled workmen in these fields. But God had no intention in Moses' day, when he was very much in command of his people, of allowing that kind of workman to come in and participate in the construction of his temple. Now, God was the plan maker back at that time. Israel left that in his hands, and so God was free to work things out his way. And his way was to endow two men, Bezalel and Aholiab, with a special skill required to do that. Let's read about that on page 62 of the book Prophets and Kings. For the construction of the wilderness tabernacle, chosen men were endowed by God with special skill and wisdom. Moses said to the children of Israel, see, the Lord hath called by name Bezalel of the tribe of Judah, and hath filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom, in understanding, and in knowledge, and in all manner of workmanship. And he hath put in his heart that he may teach both he and Aholiab of the tribe of Dan. Them hath he filled with wisdom of heart to work all manner of work of the engraver, and of the cunning workman, and of the embroider, and of the weaver, even of them that do any work. Then wrought Bezalel and Aholiab, and every wise-hearted man in whom the Lord put wisdom and understanding. Heavenly intelligences cooperated with the workmen whom God himself had chosen. Note that last sentence. God himself had chosen these particular workmen. And as the years went by, the spirit of self-sacrifice which marked Aholiab and Bezalel died out of the family. As I now read, the descendants of those workmen inherited to a large degree the talents conferred upon their forefathers, For a time, these men of Judah and Dan remained humble and unselfish. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, they lost their hold upon God and their desire to serve him unselfishly. They asked higher wages for their services because of their superior skill as workmen in the finer arts. In some instances, their request was granted, but more often they found employment in the surrounding nations. In place of the noble spirit of self-sacrifice that had filled the hearts of their illustrious ancestors, they indulged a spirit of covetousness, of grasping for more and more. That their selfish desires might be gratified, they used their God-given skill in the service of heathen kings and lent their talent to the perfecting of works which were a dishonour to their Maker. Now, by Solomon's time then, the descendants of these men whom God had blessed back in the days of Moses were no longer rendering service to God, but had gone out to work for the heathen kings around about them, who offered them considerably higher wages and rewards than they could get back in the land of Israel. Now at this point I'd like to stress a very important principle so far as work is concerned, and that is that no Christian ever goes out to work for wages. No Christian ever goes out to get money. A Christian goes out to work, and he gets money so he can go out to work. Now, of course, the philosophy in the world today is this: if I can get enough money, I quit work. Is that right? That's the worldly philosophy. But the Christian philosophy is service, and the provision of money is only a means equipping him to go about that work of service. Now, very obviously, of course, you can't serve if you don't have money. You've got to have money to eat, to put a roof over your head, to buy clothes and equipment, to gain an education, and those various things which are essential to our working program or the rendering of service to our fellow men. Now, if we have in the past gone out to work with the idea of getting money for that purpose, so we can do this or that, such as go on a long vacation, buy ourselves a sparkling new car, build a fine home, buy a yacht or whatever else it might happen to be, then our philosophy has been entirely wrong. We are placed in this world to serve. That's why we're here. No other reason than that. Well, develop a character, of course, but service is character development anyway. And therefore, our primary task is to determine where the Lord would have us to serve and in what capacity, and then the God's personal direction plan to occupy that position and to serve as God intended, and not to worry about the financial structure of the thing at all. That's God's responsibility. And remember, whereas we tend to relate the statement in Desire of Ages, page 371, to that which we class as the building up of God's work, which we think of as being only giving Bible studies or building churches or teaching school and the like, we have to remember that any service that God calls upon us to perform is a service which builds up the cause of God. It may be planting potatoes, growing wheat, painting houses, flying aeroplanes, no matter what it might be. If God gives us that work, then we are in His employ and we're building up His kingdom. And our only responsibility is to carry out the work which God has given us to do and leave the Lord of heaven to supply us with the means to carry out that work. As I said before, Christians do not work for wages. They get wages so they can work. Whereas the world, of course, is a very different philosophy altogether. Now, as I said before, by Solomon's time, these descendants from Aholiab and Bezaleel had come to the place where their one great concern was to use their talents to do what? To serve or to get money? To get money. Now, in view of the Christian principle, they were the very last men to employ in the building of Solomon's temple. Now, I shouldn't call it Solomon's temple. Whose temple was it? God's temple, built in the days of Solomon under Solomon's personal direction. But it was not Solomon's temple, even though it's called that. And in this book, Prophets and Kings, Sister White says that's a mistake to call it Solomon's temple because it was Jehovah's temple and should be called by that name at all times. So let's try and train ourselves to call it by its rightful name, God's temple, and not Solomon's temple. Now, in the building of God's temple, those men who had lost sight of the principles of God's kingdom, who were working only for money and were not working unless they got money, were the very last kind of men that should have been called upon to occupy that position. Now, Solomon had two choices. He'd either send out to the outside nations where these men already were and invite them to come and work in the temple, which he did, or he could say to God, Lord, we have a problem. We need workmen now to carry out this delicate and beautiful fine work in this building. You are the problem solver. You are the one who appoints men to your service. Right, you have the problem and wait until you supply those men, as you did back in the days of Moses. Now, those are the two options open to Solomon at that point of time. Now, if he was to invite these descendants of Aholiab and Bezaleel, who had now developed the spirit of covetousness and worked only for money, to come and work in the temple, then what would he be fostering? Pardon? He'd be fostering selfishness. And he would be encouraging the loss of the spirit of self-sacrifice. Let's go back to this first paragraph again, page 61. Prominent among the primary causes that led Solomon into extravagance and oppression was his failure to maintain and foster the spirit of self-sacrifice. Now, by bringing in these men who loved money more than anything else, he failed to foster and maintain the spirit of self-sacrifice by bringing in men within whom that spirit was not found. And that's what he did. He made that wrong choice. Now, bear in mind that there was no excuse at all for that king to take this course, because when the first temple was built, it provided a pattern of the way in which the second temple ought to be built. And whatever problems the first temple faced will be faced by the second temple. And Solomon only had to ask himself the question now, what was God's way of solving that particular problem back there? Because that will reveal to me what God's way will be to solve the same problem up here. Now, therefore, when he saw how God solved the workman problem back there, then what should he have said? That's the way to do it now, right? And therefore, he ought to have got down upon his knees, laid that problem out before God, and left it with the God of heaven to solve it in his own good time and his own good way. But, Sister White says on page 63, Solomon lost sight of this opportunity to exercise faith in God. I'll turn back now to the start of that same paragraph, which says on page 63 of Prophets and Kings, it was among these men, now which men? The men had gone out to work for the heathen kings around about them because they were more concerned about money than they were about service. And it was among these men that Solomon looked for a master workman to superintend the construction of the temple on Mount Moriah. Minute specifications in writing regarding every portion of the sacred structure had been entrusted to the king, and he could have looked to God in faith for consecrated helpers to whom would have been granted special skill for doing with exactness the work required. But Solomon lost sight of this opportunity to exercise faith in God. He sent to the king of Tyre for a man came to work in gold and in silver and in brass and in iron and in purple and crimson and blue, and it can skill to grave with the cunning men in Judah and in Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles 2 and verse 7. The Phoenician king, that is the king of Tyre, responded by sending Huram, the son of a woman of the daughters of Dan, and his father was a man of Tyre, verse 14. Huram was a descendant on his mother's side of Aholiab, to whom hundreds of years before God had given special wisdom for the construction of the Tabernacle. Now, thus Solomon lost the opportunity to exercise faith in God. Now, this principle, of course, of God being the appointer of his workmen is brought to view in many places throughout the Scriptures. I'll read just one verse now, and later we'll look at more of them as we enter into the call of Jeremiah. Let's go to Matthew chapter 9 and verses 37 and verse 38. And this principle applies no matter what the need in the Lord's work may be. Matthew 9 verse 37, Then said he unto his disciples, The harvest truly is plenteous, but the labourers are few. So there is a problem. Back in Solomon's day, the problem was, here is this great construction, but there were no labourers to superintend the construction of the building. Now, what does God direct us to do in this kind of situation? They say to us, well, now you go out and find workmen, you go out and search around till you find the men to fill these places. No, the Lord said, pray you therefore the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth labourers into his vineyard, into his harvest. Does this then make very clear the responsibility of the Church of God on the one side and the responsibility of God upon the other side? Very, very clear. What is our responsibility? To pray the Lord of the harvest. And what's the Lord's responsibility? That he will send forth those workers into the vineyard. And in that moment, when we start to look around to send forth labourers in the vineyard, whether that person that we send is ourselves or somebody else, then once again, whose place have we taken? God's place. And remember this, a man in the place of God in the church is what? The papacy. The Antichrist, right? Or the papacy. Or, to give you a third expression, it's Babylon. And no one can fight Babylon while he himself is building Babylon, right? You can't do that. You can't fight Babylon while you yourself are building Babylon. Only those who will successfully fight Babylon who come all the way out of Babylon. I come back now to Prophets and Kings to see what the unhappy result of all this was. It says, thus at the head of Solomon's company of workmen there was placed a man whose efforts were not prompted by an unselfish desire to render service to God. He served the God of this world, Mammon. The very fibres of his being were inwrought with the principles of selfishness. Now, Solomon successfully finished the temple. So once again, as we saw in our previous diagram on the board, the result of Solomon's planning for God's work did result in the building of an absolutely magnificent structure. And on the day of its dedication, the power of God came down to consume the sacrifice. But because in that construction there was interwoven human planning, in this case, of course, when Solomon called the workmen from Tyre, from the Phoenician kingdom, there was built into the characters of the people principles that were to cause their ruin. Let's now read on to see what those principles were. Because of his unusual skill, Hiram demanded large wages. That is, in the building of Jehovah's temple in Solomon's reign. Now, there's another reason, of course, as well, which has already been mentioned, and we'll just add the thought here. Because of his unusual skill and the spirit of selfishness, Hiram demanded large wages. And when, of course, you have one man, especially the man at the head of all the rest of the workmen, receiving very, very high wages, when that man, day by day, is exerting an influence of selfishness, then what is the effect going to be upon the rest of the workmen? Right, the same thing. Not at once, of course, because they'd be very enthusiastic in the structure, and they would make a difference between themselves and this heathen who's working there together with them. But eventually, and gradually, but certainly, the influence would develop in their hearts and lives. So it says, gradually. Note how many times that the way I use the word imperceptibly, little by little, gradually or slowly. But even though gradual is terribly sure, and the result does develop. Gradually, the wrong principles that he cherished came to be accepted by his associates. As they laboured with him day after day, they yielded to it the inclination to compare his wages with their own, and they began to lose sight of the holy character of their work. The spirit of self-denial left them, and in its place came the spirit of covetousness. The result was a demand for higher wages, which was granted. The baleful influences thus set in operation permeated all branches of the Lord's service and extended throughout all the kingdom. The high wages demanded and received gave to men an opportunity to indulge in luxury and extravagance. The poor were oppressed by the rich. The spirit of self-sacrifice was well nigh lost. In the far-reaching effects of these influences, they retraced one of the principal causes of the terrible apostasy of him who once was numbered amongst the wisest of mortals. At that last sentence, in the far-reaching effects of these influences. Now, what influences? Right, the loss of the spirit of self-sacrifice, the demand for higher wages, the principle of men working for money rather than receiving money so they could work. Now, in those In the far-reaching effects of these influences may be traced one of the principal causes of the terrible apostasy of him who once was numbered amongst the wisest of generals. And so we find now that added to the loss of the source and the building of God's work in man's own way, that together with the loss of the spirit of self-sacrifice were great influences which determined the development of apostasy in the heart of Solomon and also in the heart of the entire nation of Israel. A little further. The sharp contrast between the spirit and motives of the people engaged or building the wilderness temple, tabernacle, and those engaged in erecting Solomon's temple as a lesson of deep significance. The self-seeking that characterized the workers on a temple finds its counterpart today in the selfishness that rules in the world. The spirit of covetousness, of seeking for the highest position and the highest wage is rife. The willing service and joyous self-denial of the tabernacle workers is seldom met with, but this is the only spirit that should actuate the followers of Jesus. Our divine Master has given an example of how his disciples are to work. To those whom he bade, "Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men," he offered no stated sum as reward for their services. They were to share with him in self-denial and sacrifice. Not for wages we receive are we to labour. Now let's underline that sentence in our minds. Not for the wages we receive are we to labour. The motive that prompts us to work for God should have in it nothing akin to self-serving. Unselfish devotion and the spirit of sacrifice have always been and always will be the first requisite of acceptable service. Our Lord and Master designs that not one thread of selfishness shall be woven into our work. Into our efforts we are to bring the tact and skill, the exactitude and wisdom that the God of perfection required of the builders of the earthly tabernacle. Yet in all our labours we are to remember that the greatest talents or the most splendid services are acceptable only when self is laid upon the altar, a living, consuming sacrifice. And that's a very, very fine paragraph which lays out those principles very, very clearly and plainly. Not for the wages we receive are we to labour. We don't work for money. What do we work for? Service. That's the point. The motive that prompts us to work for God should have in it nothing akin to self-serving. Unselfish devotion and the spirit of sacrifice have always been and always will be the first requisite of acceptable service. Our Lord and Master desires that not one thread of selfishness shall be woven into our work, and so on. And even though you may be a very talented person, highly educated, even then we are to accept the work which God gives to us and perform it with the motive of service and not for the reward which that service may bring back to us. Therefore, the true child of God does not aim to get himself to heaven in order to acquire a great reward. Rather, the true child of God is concerned with service. They will place others there and bring about the end of the kingdom of sin and of Satan. Now we'll pass on the next study period to see to examine a third problem which developed in the experience of Solomon and greatly stimulated the decay and apostasy which was already developing at that point of time. And once again, of course, we say that in these lessons is revealed to us the way in which we too will go if we do not guard against those same temptations of the great enemy. Time has come now to close the study period as our time has run out, so let's take now our closing hymn, which